Hi, my name is Jack Boulay and I'm going to tell you about thin layer chromatography. The short answer is thin layer chromatography is a method of determining how many compounds are in a mixture by separating them based on their polarities and ultimately their solubilities within a chosen solvent. Now, there are some preliminary notes that I think would be very helpful to cover before we go on to the procedure. First, adsorbance. If a material is adsorbent, that means that it can collect condensed particles of gases or liquids in an extremely thin layer. This is different from absorbent because whereas in absorption, particles of a gas or liquid are taken into the absorbent material, in adsorption, they're merely collected onto the surface. Now, a good common adsorption material is silica. A retention factor is equal to the distance that a sample travels divided by the distance the solvent travels, and this will make sense when I explain the procedure, so don't worry about it just yet. For now, all you need to know is that the retention factor is polarity dependent, and that the less polar a sample is, the greater its retention factor will be, because it will climb up the TLC plate faster and higher. Also, just as a side note, the retention factor will never be greater than 1, because the sample will never rise higher than the solvent. So the TLC plate that you're going to be using is a rectangular sheet composed of glass, metal, or plastic, and it'll be covered with a thin layer of an adsorbent material, which of course is oftentimes silica, as I said before. Now there are two phases. There's the stationary phase and the mobile phase. The stationary phase is the silica, that is, it's the adsorbent layer. The mobile phase is when the sample is carried upward by the solvent. Remember, the adsorbent is oftentimes silica, which is polar. If one of the samples that you're testing on the TLC plate is polar, it'll likely stay with the silica gel and not rise as much. So here's the procedure. On the TLC plate, use a straight edge to mark a line about 1 centimeter above the bottom of the plate, and make markings indicating where the drops for each sample are going to be placed. And use capillary tubes to gather small droplets of the samples to be tested, and lightly dab a small amount onto the marked locations of the TLC plate. And you want to procure an Erlenmeyer flask and add a little bit of solvent to it, but not so much that it would cover the dots on the TLC plate once placed inside. Place the plate inside the Erlenmeyer flask and cover the flask with a watch glass. Once the solvent has climbed up the TLC plate and is about half a centimeter below the top, remove the watch glass and remove the plate, and mark that point with a pencil and a straight edge. Encircle any dots that are visible along the plate. Now here's some things to avoid. First, be very careful not to slant the line where you're placing dots of the substances, or else one substance will be lower than another, and therefore more submerged when placed into the mobile phase container, and this will skew its retention factor value. Also, don't press too hard with the pencil, because that'll mess up the adsorbent layer. And don't use a pen, because the ink is likely going to travel up the plate and skew your data again. And lastly, remember to put the watch glass on top of the flask, because you're dealing with organic compounds, and because they're volatile, they may escape otherwise. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.